This is a story from the backwoods of America. My name is Silas, though most folks around here just call me Uncle Silas. I have lived in these woods for more years than I care to count. In a cabin my grandfather built with his own 2 hands from oak and pine that grew right where you are standing now. The logs still smell of resin when the sun gets hot, and in winter the frost makes patterns on the windows like fingers reaching across glass. I am telling you this story tonight because it needs telling. Not because it is mine, but because it belonged to someone who cannot tell it anymore. A man named Harlan. He was my uncle's closest friend, back when my uncle still walked these hills. Back when Hollow Ridge was more than just a name on a map nobody looks at. Hollow Ridge sits so far back in the mountains that most people do not even know it exists. The roads do not go there anymore. They used to, back in the 30s and 40s, when logging was still good and families still believed they could carve out a life in places the rest of the world had given up on. But the roads crumbled, the bridges rotted, and one by one, the families moved away or died off, until only a handful of old-timers remained, living in houses that leaned like tired old men against the weight of time. My uncle used to say that Hollow Ridge was not a place you went to, it was a place you ended up in. And once you were there, leaving took more effort than most folks had left in them. Harlan was the mailman, not just for Hollow Ridge, but for all the forgotten corners of this county. He rode a chestnut mare named Bess, pulling a small cart with leather bags full of letters, parcels, newspapers that were already a week old by the time they reached the end of his route. He was a quiet man, my uncle said. Serious, the kind of man who did his job because it needed doing, not because anyone thanked him for it. And in places like Hollow Ridge, that job mattered. Those letters were the only thread connecting people to a world that had moved on without them. Harlan had been riding that route for 23 years when it happened. 23 years of muddy trails, of fording creeks that swelled with rain, of knocking on doors that sometimes did not open because the person inside had died weeks ago and nobody knew yet. He knew every house, every name, every family story. He knew who was sick, who had grandchildren in the city, who was waiting for a pension check that never seemed to come. But one morning in late April, everything changed. It was 1952. I remember because my uncle had just come back from the war, and he was staying with Harlan for a spell, helping him with the route while he got his legs back under him. My uncle told me this story only once, sitting right where you are sitting now, with the fire burning low and the night pressing close against the windows. He did not like to talk about it, but he told me because he said someone needed to remember. Someone needed to know what Harlan found that day. The morning started like any other. Harlan loaded up the cart, checked Bess's shoes, and headed out before the sun had burned the mist off the ridges. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles, and the birds were singing the way they do in spring, when everything feels new and possible. My uncle rode beside him on an old mule, and they talked about small things. Fishing, the price of tobacco, whether the Johnson's roof would make it through another winter. The first strange thing happened at the McCready place. The McCready house had been abandoned for 15 years. The family had moved to Knoxville after their boy drowned in the creek, and nobody had lived there since. The porch had caved in, the windows were broken, and honeysuckle had grown up through the floorboards. But the mailbox was still standing, leaning at an angle like a crooked tooth. When Harlan pulled up beside it, he saw something that made him stop cold. There was a letter inside, not a letter he had delivered. A letter that was already there, waiting. My uncle said Harlan stared at it for a long time before he reached in and pulled it out. It was yellowed around the edges, like old paper gets when it sits in a drawer for decades. The envelope was thick, made of a kind of paper they do not make anymore, the kind with a texture like cloth. And it was sealed with black wax, pressed with a mark that looked like a tree with roots spreading wide. The address was written in careful, looping handwriting, ink the color of rust. It was addressed to Samuel McCready, the boy who had drowned in 1937. Harlan turned the envelope over in his hands. There was no return address, The postmark was smudged, but my uncle swore he could make out the name of a town he had never heard of. Something like Ashford or Ashfeld, with a date that did not make sense. The stamp was old too, the kind they stopped using before the war. My uncle asked Harlan what he was going to do with it. Harlan did not answer. He just tucked it into his bag and kept riding. At the next house, there was another letter. This one was in the mailbox of the old Kirby place, which had burned down in 1943. The chimney still stood, black and skeletal against the trees, but everything else was ash and memory. The mailbox was rusted through, barely held up by a post wrapped in poison ivy. Inside was another letter, identical to the first. Same paper, same black wax, same handwriting. This one was addressed to Eula Kirby, dead since the fire. Harlan did not say anything. He took the letter and kept moving. At every house along the ridge, in every mailbox, there was a letter waiting. Some of the names my uncle recognized, some he did not. But every single one was addressed to someone who had been dead for years. 10 years? 20? 40? Some of the names went back so far that even Harlan, who knew everyone, had to stop and think before he remembered who they were. There were 12 letters in all. 12 houses. 12 names that belonged to ghosts. By the time they reached the end of the route, my uncle said the air felt different, heavier, like the sky was pressing down on them, even though it was a clear blue day without a cloud in sight. Bess kept tossing her head and snorting, the way horses do when they smell something they do not like. My uncle's mule refused to go any farther than the last bend in the trail. The last house on the ridge belonged to Ms. Cora. She was the only person still living up there, a midwife, ancient even then, with hands like tree roots and eyes that saw more than most people wanted her to see. She had delivered half the babies in the county, including my uncle, and she had closed the eyes of just as many dead. People said she knew things. Not magic, not witchcraft, just things. The way some people know when a storm is coming before the sky changes. Harlan knocked on her door, holding one of the letters in his hand. Ms. Cora opened the door halfway and looked at him with those sharp, unblinking eyes. She did not say hello. She just looked at the letter. Then she stepped back and shook her head. "That is not for me," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had weight to it, like a stone dropping into deep water. Harlan tried to explain. He told her he had found it in her mailbox, that it was addressed to someone who used to live there, that he did not know what to do with it. Ms. Cora cut him off. "I said it is not for me, and it is not for you either." She looked past him toward the trail, toward the other mailboxes standing like silent witnesses along the ridge. "Those letters are not questions. They are answers, and you do not want to know what was asked." My uncle said the way she said it made his skin go cold, even though the sun was warm on his back. Harlan asked her what she meant. Ms. Cora just looked at him with something like pity in her eyes. "Go home, Harlan," she said. "Leave those letters where you found them. Some things are not meant to travel." Then she closed the door. Harlan stood on that porch for a long time, my uncle said. Just stood there, holding that letter, staring at the closed door. The wind moved through the trees, making a sound like whispers, and somewhere far off, a crow called out, sharp and lonely. Finally, Harlan turned and walked back to the cart. He did not say a word. He just climbed up, took the reins, and started back down the trail. But he did not go home. Instead, he turned Bess toward the old post office. The Hollow Ridge post office had been closed since 1948. It was a small building, not much bigger than a shed, with peeling white paint and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. The sign out front was so faded you could barely read it. Inside, there were still sorting boxes on the wall, each one labeled with a name, most of them belonging to people who were long gone. Dust covered everything like a blanket, and the air smelled like old paper and mice. Harlan tied Bess to the porch rail and went inside. My uncle followed, though he said later he did not want to. Something about the place felt wrong, not haunted. He was careful to tell me that. Just wrong, the way a room feels wrong when you walk into it and realize someone has been going through your things. Harlan laid all 12 letters out on the counter. My uncle said they looked strange, sitting there in a row like that. Too neat, too deliberate, like someone had arranged them. Harlan stood there for a long time just looking at them. Then he started opening them, one by one. My uncle said he should have stopped him. He said he knew even then that it was a mistake, but he did not say anything. He just watched. The first letter Harlan opened was addressed to Samuel McCready, the boy who had drowned. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in that same careful handwriting. The ink was brown, like it had been written with something other than a pen. My uncle could not read it from where he was standing, but he saw Harlan's face change as he read, saw the color drain out of it. Harlan did not say what it said. He just folded it up, put it back in the envelope, and opened the next one. And the next, and the next. Each letter was different, but my uncle said Harlan's expression stayed the same. Pale, shaken, like he was reading something he should not be reading, something that was not meant for his eyes. When he finished the last one, Harlan stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. Then he gathered up all the letters, put them back in his bag, and walked outside without a word. My uncle asked him what was in the letters. Harlan did not answer. He just stood there on the porch, looking out at the ridge, at the line of trees dark against the sky. Finally, he said, "They are all the same." My uncle asked what he meant. "Every letter," Harlan said quietly. "Every single one. They all say the same thing." He would not tell my uncle what that thing was. The sun was starting to go down by then, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. My uncle said they should head back, that they could figure it out in the morning, but Harlan shook his head. "I am going to stay here tonight," he said. "I need to think." My uncle did not like it, but he knew Harlan well enough to know there was no point in arguing. So he rode back alone, leaving Harlan standing on the porch of that abandoned post office, with his bag full of letters addressed to the dead. That was the last time anyone saw him. The next morning, my uncle rode back to the post office just after dawn. The air was cold and wet with dew, and the birds were just starting to sing. Bess was still tied to the porch rail, her ears flicking back and forth, her breath steaming in the cool air. The cart was still there too. Everything looked exactly the way it had the night before. Except Harlan was gone. My uncle called his name. No answer. He went inside the post office, but it was empty. The letters were gone too. The counter where Harlan had laid them out was bare, just dust, and a faint rectangular outline where something had been sitting for a long time. My uncle searched the woods around the building. He checked the trail, the creek, the old cemetery on the hill. He called and called until his voice went hoarse. But there was no sign of Harlan, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign of a struggle. It was like he had simply stepped off the edge of the world. When my uncle finally gave up and came back to the post office, he noticed something he had missed before. There was a letter on the table inside. Just one, sitting in the center of the dust, like someone had placed it there deliberately. It was sealed with black wax, just like the others, and it was addressed to Harlan. My uncle said his hands were shaking when he picked it up. The envelope was the same as the others, thick, yellowed paper with that strange texture. The handwriting was the same, but the postmark was different. It was dated the next day, April 24th, the day my uncle was standing there holding it in his hands. He should have opened it. He knew that. But he could not bring himself to do it. He said it felt like holding something, alive, something that was watching him, waiting to see what he would do. So he did the only thing he could think of. He put the letter back on the table, walked outside, untied Bess, and led her home. He told the sheriff what had happened. The sheriff organized a search party. They combed the ridge for 3 days. checking every house, every cave, every hollow where a man might have fallen or gotten lost. They found nothing, no body, no clues, nothing. Eventually they gave up. Harlan was declared missing, and that was the end of it. My uncle kept Bess, and the mail route was reassigned to someone else. Life went on the way it always does. But the story did not end there. A few weeks later, my uncle went back to the post office one more time. He told himself he was just checking, just making sure he had not missed anything. But really, he wanted to see if the letter was still there. It was not. The table was empty, no dust outline, no trace that anything had ever been sitting there. But when my uncle walked outside, he noticed something else, the mailboxes along the ridge. The ones at the abandoned houses, the burned-out places, the ruins where nobody had lived in decades. They were full, not with letters Harlan had left behind, with new letters, fresh ones with the same black wax seals, the same careful handwriting. My uncle did not touch them. He did not even get close. He just turned Bess around and rode home as fast as she could carry him. He never went back to Hollow Ridge after that. I was just a boy when my uncle told me this story, maybe 10 or 11 years old. I remember sitting by the fire, watching the shadows move on the walls, and feeling like the darkness outside was listening. My uncle did not look at me when he talked. He just stared into the flames, his voice low and steady, like he was confessing something. He told me he tried to forget about Hollow Ridge, tried to put it out of his mind and go on with his life. He got married, built a house, had children. He worked hard and kept his head down and did not talk about what had happened. But every spring, when the dogwood started blooming and the air turned warm and soft, he would think about Harlan. And he would wonder he was not the only one. Over the years, other people started talking about Hollow Ridge. Hunters who went up there looking for deer would come back with strange stories. They said the mailboxes were always full, no matter what time of year it was. They said if you opened one, you would find letters inside, addressed to people who had been dead for generations. Some of them even took letters, thinking it was a joke or some kind of prank. But the ones who took letters always brought them back. My uncle knew a man named Pritchard, a logger who worked the hills north of the ridge. Pritchard was tough as boot leather, not afraid of anything. He laughed when people told him about the mailboxes, said it was nonsense. So one day he rode up there on a dare and pulled a letter out of the Kirby mailbox. It was addressed to Eula Kirby, just like the one Harlan had found. Pritchard opened it right there, standing in the middle of the trail. He never told anyone what it said. But my uncle saw him a week later, and he said Pritchard looked like he had aged 10 years. His hands shook when he held his coffee cup, and his eyes had a faraway look, like he was seeing something nobody else could see. Pritchard put the letter back in the mailbox the next day, rode all the way up there just to return it. After that, he would not talk about Hollow Ridge, would not even let people mention it in his presence. My uncle told me there were others too. A surveyor who tried to map the old roads and found letters in places where there were no mailboxes, just posts driven into the ground, weathered gray and leaning. A teacher from the county seat who got curious and took a letter home, only to return it 3 days later, pale and silent. A reporter from Knoxville who wanted to write a story about the mystery of Hollow Ridge, but left after 1 day and never published a word. The pattern was always the same. People went looking, people found letters, people brought them back, but nobody ever stayed, and nobody ever found Harlan. My uncle said he thought about riding back up there himself, just once, to see if he could find the letter that had been addressed to Harlan. The one with the postmark from the future. He thought maybe if he read it, he would understand what had happened. Maybe he would find some clue, some explanation that would make sense of it all. But he never did. He said there was a part of him that did not want to know, that some questions are better left unanswered. I was older when I finally went to Hollow Ridge myself. I was maybe 25, restless and stubborn, the way young men are when they think they know more than their elders. I'd heard the story so many times by then that it had started to feel like a legend, something that might not have really happened the way my uncle said it did. So I decided to see for myself. I went in late March, when the mountains were just starting to green up and the creeks were running high with snowmelt. I rode my truck as far as the old logging road would take me, then walked the rest of the way. The trail was overgrown, choked with laurel and blackberry canes, and it took me most of the morning to reach the ridge. When I got there, I understood why people did not stay. It was not that the place was frightening exactly. It was just empty, hollow like the name said. The houses were still standing, or what was left of them, but they did not look like places where people had lived. They looked like shells, like something had been scooped out of them and only the bones remained. The air was still, no birds singing, no wind, just silence, thick and heavy as a blanket, and the mailboxes were full. I walked along the trail looking at them, rusted metal boxes on crooked posts, half hidden by weeds. Some of them had names painted on the side, so faded I could barely read them. And in every single one there were letters. I opened the first mailbox I came to. Inside were 3 envelopes, all sealed with black wax, all addressed in that same careful handwriting my uncle had described. The names were ones I did not recognize, but the dates on the postmarks made my stomach turn. They were from the future, 6 months from now, a year. One of them was dated 10 years ahead. I did not take any of them. I just closed the mailbox and kept walking. At the end of the trail, I found the old post office. It was more collapsed than I had expected. The roof sagging in the middle, the porch half rotted through. But the door was still there, hanging open like a mouth. I stood outside for a long time looking at it. I could hear something inside. Not a voice, not a sound exactly, just a presence. Like the building was breathing, I almost went in. I was standing right there on the porch, one hand on the doorframe, ready to step inside. But then I heard it, a sound, faint and far away, but clear as a bell, the jingle of a harness, the creak of a cart, the slow, steady clop of hooves on packed dirt. I turned and looked back down the trail, expecting to see someone coming. But there was nothing. Just trees and shadows and that thick, pressing silence. The sound came again. Closer this time, like it was just around the bend, just out of sight. I did not wait to see what it was. I turned and ran back down the trail, stumbling over roots and rocks, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I did not stop until I reached my truck, and even then, I sat there for 10 minutes with the doors locked, catching my breath, listening. I never heard the sound again. But I did not go back either. This is a story from the backwoods of America. That was 30 years ago. I'm an old man myself now, sitting in the same cabin where my uncle told me his story, staring into the same fire. And I still think about Hollow Ridge. I think about Harlan and those letters, and what Ms. Cora said about answers. Over the years, I have tried to make sense of it. I have read books about strange phenomena, talked to people who study the unexplained, even corresponded with a professor from a university who was interested in what he called temporal anomalies. But none of it ever felt right. None of it explained what I saw, what my uncle saw, what Harlan must have seen before he disappeared. Because here is the thing I have come to understand: the world is bigger than we think it is, deeper. There are places where the rules we take for granted do not quite apply, where time moves differently, where the dead and the living are not as separate as we like to believe, not because of magic, not because of spirits or demons or any of the things people tell stories about to scare each other in the dark, but because the world is old, older than we can imagine. And in the old places, the forgotten places, things linger, memories, debts, messages. I think that is what the letters are. Not supernatural exactly, just something we do not have words for yet. A kind of echo, maybe. A way for the past to reach forward and touch the present, to remind us that nothing is ever truly gone. Harlan found those letters because he was the one who was supposed to find them. Not by accident, not by chance, but because he was the thread that connected all those people, the McCreadys, the Kirbys, Ms. Cora, all the families who had lived and died on that ridge. He carried their words for years. their hopes and fears and little pieces of their lives wrapped up in envelopes and tied with string. And maybe in some way we do not understand, they needed to send something back. I do not know what was in those letters. My uncle never told me and I never asked. But I think they were messages from the past, written by people who wanted to be remembered. People who did not want to be forgotten, swallowed up by time and silence. And Harlan read them, and whatever he read changed him, made him understand something that we are not meant to understand, and that is why he disappeared, not because something took him, but because he chose to go. Because once you read a message like that, once you see the shape of the world the way it really is, you cannot come back. You cannot pretend anymore. You cannot live in the ordinary world, knowing what you know. At least that is what I believe. I have been back to Hollow Ridge a few times over the years. Not often, just enough to check, to see if anything has changed. The mailboxes are still full, the letters are still there. And every spring, when the dogwoods bloom and the air turns soft, I hear that sound again. The jingle of a harness, the creak of a cart. The sound of someone making a delivery, even though there is nobody left to receive it. I do not open the mailboxes anymore. I do not touch the letters. I just leave a stone on the last post, the one that used to hold the Kirby mailbox, and I walk back down the trail. It is a small gesture, but I think it matters. I think it is important to remember that there are things in this world we do not understand, and that is okay. We do not have to understand them. We do not have to explain them, or solve them, or make them fit into our neat little categories of what is possible and what is not. We just have to respect them, because those letters are not for us. They never were. They are for the people whose names are written on the envelopes, the people who lived and loved and died on that ridge, who are gone now but not forgotten. And maybe that is all they ever wanted, to be remembered, to have someone know that they were here, that they mattered, that their lives meant something. Harlan understood that, and maybe that is why he stayed. I think about that sometimes, late at night, when the fire burns low and the cabin creaks and settles around me. I think about Harlan, making his deliveries somewhere we cannot see, carrying messages between the living and the dead, doing the job he was always meant to do, and I think about the letter that was left for him, the one with the postmark from the future, dated the day after he disappeared. I wonder what it said. I wonder if it was an invitation, or a warning, or just a simple acknowledgement that his work was not done, that there were still deliveries to be made, routes to be ridden, people who needed their mail. I will never know, and that is all right, because some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some doors are not meant to be opened, and some paths lead to places we are not supposed to follow, but we can honor them. We can remember them. We can leave a stone on a mailbox post and walk away, knowing that the world is wider and stranger and more beautiful than we will ever fully understand. That is what I learned from Hollow Ridge. That is what Harlan taught me, even though I never met him, and that is why even now, when I pass by the old logging road that leads up to the ridge, I slow down. I look at the trees dark and deep, and I listen for the sound of a cart, the jingle of a harness, the slow, steady rhythm of hooves on packed dirt, and sometimes, just sometimes I hear it, not because I am afraid, but because I am grateful. Grateful that there are still places in this world where the past is not quite past, where the dead are not quite gone, where a man can spend eternity doing the work he loved, carrying messages that need to be carried, and grateful that I was wise enough to leave those letters where I found them, because they were not for me. They were never for me. The fire is dying now. The embers glow soft and red, like the eye of something ancient watching from the dark. Outside, the wind moves through the pines, making that sound like whispers, like voices just beyond the edge of hearing. I will sit here a while longer, the way I always do, and when I finally go to bed, I will leave the door unlatched, the way I always do, just in case someone needs to make a delivery, just in case there is a letter somewhere with my name on it, and when that day comes, When I open my mailbox and find an envelope sealed with black wax, addressed in careful handwriting to a man who is not quite dead but not quite living anymore, I hope I will have the courage to do what Harlan did. I hope I will read it, and I hope I will understand. Until then, I will keep the fire burning. I will keep the stories alive. And I will remember that the world is full of mysteries, and that is not something to fear, that is something to cherish. Good night, friend.
Sleep well.
And if you ever find yourself passing through the mountains, and you see a mailbox standing alone by a forgotten road, full of letters that should not be there, do what I do, leave a stone and walk away. Some messages are not for us, but they still need to be honored. If this story made you glance twice at the trees on your way home, if it made you wonder what's watching from the edge of the dark, or if just for a moment you felt like the woods were listening too, then this fire is yours as much as mine. Go ahead and hit like, not for me, but so others who feel the same can find their way here. Subscribe to Backwoods Yarns and tap that bell. Because every night, when the wind's quiet and the thicket's holding its breath, there's another story waiting. And if you know someone who still believes the world is only what the eyes can see, share this tale with them. Might just open their eyes to what's been watching all along. Until next time, stay quiet, stay curious, and remember, not everything that sees you is meant to be seen back. Uncle Silas.